If you look closely at the turning points of World War II, the Allies' greatest secret weapon wasn't a piece of tech, it was often Hitler's own catastrophic decision-making. While the history books portray a master strategist, the reality is a man whose ego-driven blunders effectively sabotaged his own empire from the inside out. But while the math of war suggests he was likely destined to lose anyway, it didn't have to end so quickly. From refusing to let his armies retreat at Stalingrad, his fingerprints are all over the Third Reich's collapse. If he had made a few different choices, if he had allowed his tanks to push on at Dunkirk, neutralised the RAF before moving east, or prioritising vital logistics of Moscow over his obsessions of wonder weapons, transforming the 6-year World War into a decade-long nightmare, in today's video we are looking at the tactical what-ifs that could have kept the Third Reich on life support for years, and why even with those changes, the looming reality of global oil shortages and the American atomic bomb meant that Hitler was ultimately just delaying the inevitable. People often imagine the Nazi war machine as a fully mechanised high-tech force. In reality, 80% of the German army relied on horse-drawn carriages for transport. Through the entire war, while the US was mass-producing the standardised rugged truck, German supply lines were literally pulling wagons through Russian mud at a painfully slow 3 miles per hour. Only 10 to 20% of German divisions were fully motorised. Germany entered the Soviet Union with over 600,000 horses, and by the end of the war they had used a total of nearly 2.7 million. Horses have a massive logistical footprint. They need massive amounts of water and fodder, which is often bulky and heavy to transport. They're susceptible to weather and disease and exhaustion. In the Russian winter, horses died by the thousands, leaving the German artillery stuck in the snow. Because Hitler prioritised projects like heavy tanks, never developing a standardised mass-produced utility truck, they used a patchwork of captured French and British and civilian trucks. This meant a single division might need spare parts for 20 types of engine. The manpower crisis is perhaps the most ironic of Hitler's blunder. Hitler's vision for the 1,000-year Reich was built on a very traditional, patriarchal social structure: children, kitchen and church, while the UK and US were aggressively recruiting women into the aircraft factories and ammunition plants. As early as the 1940s, Hitler resisted this until it was far too late. He believed that having women work in factories would degrade the German family and lower the national morale, contrast to how the Soviet Union used women even in frontline roles. Contrary to Britain, with roughly 90% of single women and 80% of married women involved in the war effort by 1943. This allowed the Allies to put every able-bodied man on the front lines. Even in the darkest days of 1944, German factories were often understaffed or staffed by men who were too old or injured to fight, while millions of German women remained at home. The poison solution: slave labour. To solve the manpower shortage without corrupting German women, Hitler turned to foreign forced labour. By 1944, nearly 1/4 of the entire German workforce consisted of slave labourers, POWs, and civilians snatched from occupied Eastern Europe and concentration camps. Slaves were starved, beaten, and lived in terror from purely a cold-blooded economic standpoint. A starving, terrified worker is significantly less productive than a well-fed, motivated one, and causing oversight tax. To keep millions of slaves working, Hitler had to divert thousands of able-bodied soldiers to act as overseers and guards, creating a tax on manpower. Naval failures was another area. The decision to prioritise a massive surface fleet, or ego ships, over a dedicated submarine fleet, often cited by naval historians as the Germans' greatest missed opportunity. While battleships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz look impressive in documentaries, they were strategically obsolete. From the moment they were launched, Hitler and the naval leadership initially wanted a fleet that could go toe-to-toe with the British Navy in a traditional line of battle. This resulted in the Z Plan, a massive construction project for battleships and cruisers. The cost of building a single battleship like the Bismarck, or its sister ship, consumed enough high-grade steel, skilled labour and copper to build roughly 100 to 150 Type 7 new U-boats. The result: the Bismarck sailed exactly one mission before being sunk in 1941. The Tirpitz spent most of the war in hiding in a Norwegian fjord, never even firing its gun at an enemy ship. They were eventually steel fortresses that the Allies simply blocked or sank with aircraft carriers. Admiral Karl Dönitz argued from the beginning that Germany didn't need a surface fleet to win. He believed that if he had 300 operational U-boats at the start of the war, he could sever Britain's Atlantic lifeline. Britain was a small island that imported most of its food and fuel, at one point only having a few weeks of grain reserves left. The fix: if Germany had cancelled the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst, they could have flooded the Atlantic with 400 plus U-boats by 1940. This would have likely overwhelmed the Royal Navy's escort capabilities before the United States even entered the war with its massive Liberty ship production program. Towards the end of the war, Germany finally developed the Type 21 U-boat, the world's first true submarine. Unlike earlier boats that were just diving boats that spent most of their time on the surface, the Type 21 could stay submerged for 6 days and was faster underwater than most of the Allied escort ships on the surface. Because resources were being diverted to weapons and other projects, the Type 21 didn't enter service in significant numbers until 1945. Another of his huge blunders was the abandoning of his men. While the Red Army was marching on Berlin in 1945, there were roughly 200,000 to 300,000 battle-hardened German soldiers, including some of the best divisions, just sitting in the Baltics, completely cut off from the rest of the war. Hitler developed an obsession with what he called Festungen, or fortresses. He believed that if German troops held onto Pacific cities or coastal areas behind enemy lines, that they would act as breakwaters, tying down Soviet troops and serving as a jumping-off point for future counterattacks that would never come. In late 1944, Operation Bagration smashed the German centre and reached the Baltic Sea, cutting off Army Group North in the Courland Peninsula of Latvia. Hitler's top generals, including Heinz Guderian, begged him to evacuate these 30 divisions by sea, so that they could be used to defend the German heartland. The blunder: Hitler refused. He insisted that holding the Courland was necessary to protect the U-boat training grounds in the Baltic Sea and to keep Sweden from joining the Allies. The Soviets realised these Germans weren't going anywhere and simply bypassed them. They left just enough troops to keep the pockets contained effectively, turning Courland into an armed POW camp. Nearly 300,000 of Germany's best troops were left to rot in Latvia, while Berlin was being stormed by Soviet tanks, with largely French SS fighting in Berlin. This wasn't just a one-time mistake, it was Hitler's standard operating procedure from 1941 onwards. The psychology: Hitler believed that the German retreat in World War I had caused the collapse of the home front. He was convinced that as long as soldiers were ordered to stand the ground, they would never lose. The reality in modern mobile warfare: the goal is to keep your army intact. By forbidding retreat, Hitler allowed Soviets to perform cauldron battles. The Soviets would simply wrap around the stationary German units, trap them in pockets, and slowly annihilate them. By 1944, Germany was running out of everything, especially trained men. At Stalingrad, he had lost over 250,000 men. In Tunisia, his refusal to evacuate led to the surrender of 230,000 German and Italian troops. And the 300,000 in the Courland pocket: if those 700,000 plus veteran soldiers had been allowed to retreat and reform a defensive line, it easily could have elongated the war into late 1945 and even into 1946. The failure of the Axis powers to coordinate their strategies is one of the most significant what-if scenarios of the war. Despite being part of the Tripartite Pact, they essentially fought 3 separate, isolated wars that often worked across purposes. If Germany and Japan had coordinated, they could have met in the middle, specifically in the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. The strategy: if Japan's navy had pushed into the Indian Ocean and the German Africa Corps had seized the Suez Canal, they could have cut the British Empire in half. This would have stopped the flow of oil from the Middle East to Britain and prevented the Allies from using the Persian corridor to send supplies to the Soviet Union. Unlike the Allies, who shared almost everything, the Axis powers were incredibly secretive with each other. Germany had superior tank and jet technology, while Japan had a world-class torpedoes and aircraft carrier tactics. They only began seriously sharing blueprints and materials late in the war. By then, most of the submarines were sunk by Allied patrols. Japan ended up with the blueprints for German jets they couldn't build, and Germany got rubber they couldn't transport back to their factories. Even with these strategic corrections, if the panzers had rolled through Dunkirk, the jets had cleared the skies, and the U-boats had strangled the Atlantic, Germany was a nation with wonder weapons but no fuel, fighting an industrial titan that could outproduce them 10 to 1 in almost every category, from trucks to heavy bombs. While Hitler's armies were literally retreating in horse-drawn wagons, American and Soviet factories were flooding the world with standardised machinery and a seemingly endless supply of oil that the Axis powers could simply not match. Any hope of a defensive stalemate would have been vaporised by the Manhattan Project. Even a German-occupied Europe would have been defenceless against the B-29, carrying an atomic payload and an inevitable technological wall that Hitler's fragmented and underfunded scientific programs could never match. Thank you for listening, and consider subscribing to the channel.